Today we're going to begin looking at how economists measure the economy, measure the size of the economy, measure how well the economy is doing. And we start with this idea of GDP. And the question is, what is GDP? It stands for Gross Domestic Product. And it's one of the most important economic numbers that people follow in the news. So what's included in GDP? GDP is a measure of what we call aggregate output. It's looking for the value of all of the goods and services made in our economy, but not really all of the goods and services, what we call the final goods and services. So we don't care about what are called intermediate goods. We don't care about the value of all the parts that go into making a product. We care about what that final product is worth. So a final product would be a laptop computer, for example, something used by people. It's no longer being developed, it's no longer being processed, it is in its end stage of production, compared to intermediate goods, which would be the cost of the materials that went into making the laptop. We don't care about those intermediate goods, and mostly because the value of those goods is included in the price of the final good. So if we were to include intermediate goods as well as final goods, we'd basically be double counting and overestimating the size of our economy. And so we're going to use this measure of GDP to track growth and see how we're doing overall as an economy over time. There are some components of GDP, and we can break those down into what we call consumption, investment, government, exports, and imports. So consumption is individual consumers and our purchases of goods and services. Investment is basically business purchases of goods and services, as well as businesses' purchase of equipment, for example, or construction. It does not include the purchase of things like stocks or bonds or mutual funds, because those aren't products, there's not goods or services, they're not new. And so any sort of thing we typically think of when we talk about investing is not what we're talking about here under investment. This is just business purchase of goods and services. Then we've got the government, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, single actor in our economy. Then we have what are called exports. That's goods made in the United States and sold in other countries, compared to imports, which are goods made in other countries and sold into the United States. So if we wanted to practice for a minute, we could look at a situation like this. Due to a tax cut, consumers decide to buy more new cars. This would be an indication that GDP is increasing, because we would see an increase in consumption as individuals buy more stuff when they have more money in their pockets. Or this situation, people are worried about an increasing budget deficit. The government decides to buy fewer military planes. So the government is spending more money than it's taking in taxes. People are concerned by this, so maybe the government decides to spend less money. In which case we would see GDP shrink, because now the government component, that G component of C, I, G, and net exports, is getting smaller. So another way to check that you sort of understand what's included in GDP is to try categorizing each of these 10 items and seeing whether it's included in GDP or not included in GDP. And you can pause the video and take a crack at this, and then when you're ready, press play again, and you'll see the answers. A haircut would be included in GDP because it's a consumer's purchase of a service, in this case a haircut. Honda purchasing steel for producing new cars would not be included, because that's an example of what we call an intermediate good. That steel would go into the making of the car, and it's the value of the car that we care about. Dell Computers selling computers to Japan would be included. That would be an export. McDonald's purchasing a brand new grill would also be included, because that's an example of business investment. It's the purchase of capital. Macy's paying its employees an hourly wage would not be included, because, at least in this way of measuring GDP, giving employees money doesn't mean anything as far as producing new goods and services. Instead, we're going to wait to see what they use their money for, and whatever they buy with that salary would count towards GDP. Students purchasing airplane tickets to Hawaii would count, because that's a good or a service. Pepsi donating money to the Susan G. Komen Foundation does not count. It is excluded because they're not buying a good or a service. A stereo purchased on eBay is also excluded because it's not new. And that's one of the key things here too, is that goods need to be new. Otherwise, we've counted it already in GDP. We're trying to track the value of new goods and services being made in our economy. A citizen choosing to pay their property tax is not included. That's excluded because it's not a purchase of a good or service. And the government buying supplies from the military would be included because they're now buying those goods for the military to operate. When measuring GDP, it's important to make a distinction between what we call real GDP and nominal GDP. These are also two different measures that can be confusing and cause you to misinterpret how well the economy is doing or how poorly it's doing. When we talk about nominal GDP, we mean what is the value of goods and services in today's dollars? How many dollars today would it take to buy all of the goods and services? That nominal GDP does not take into account the loss of purchasing power as a result of inflation. So to compare one year's nominal GDP to another's is to give an unfair characterization or an unfair comparison between the two, because we don't know how much more expensive goods are today compared to what they were maybe 20 years ago. It's possible that nominal GDP could be higher today than it was yesterday, but our living standards will actually be worse, because we need to look at what's called real GDP, which is making a correction for inflation. It's making comparison from year to year, assuming that the products themselves haven't changed in value, that the only thing that has changed is the number of products being sold. Because if we're selling and making more goods and services, that's an indication of a healthier economy. Spending more on it doesn't necessarily mean that our economy is in a healthy situation. So here's an example of nominal versus real and how those numbers may differ and why they're important. Real GDP is telling us how much a change in GDP is caused by the change in the actual output. So we're going to hold prices constant and just let quantity change to see if we're producing more goods than we were before. So in this example, in year one, nominal GDP is $50 because we made 50 apples and we were $1 per apple. So our nominal GDP was $50. It would cost $50 to buy those 50 apples. In year two, nominal GDP is $120 because we produced 60 apples. The price increased to $2 a piece, and so $120 went into purchasing those products. But are we really more than twice as healthy an economy as we were before? In nominal terms, yes, but in real terms, no. To calculate real GDP, we're going to take the price of an apple in a given year. We're going to call that a base year, and we're going to see how much it would cost to purchase year one's production in year one, and we'll see how much it would cost to purchase year two's production in year one and compare. So the real GDP for year one, we would take the 50 apples times the set constant price of $1, and that tells us real GDP is $50 in this economy. If I were to make 60 apples in that year one, I'd be selling those 60 apples for the set price of $1, and that would cost me $60 total. So is the economy growing? Yes, we're producing more stuff than we were in year one. But are we twice as big as we were in year one in real terms? The answer here is no. And the reason why is because the price of apples doubled from year one to year two. So that nominal number of $120 is very misleading when it comes to looking at how healthy or how strong our economy is growing. Now let's look at another example. This time let's pretend that there are two products, corn and soybeans, and we have 3 years, 2012, 2013, and 2014. If we're going to calculate nominal GDP, we would want to know how much would it cost in 2012 to buy 2012's production. So I would take this 100 tons of corn and multiply it by the price of corn, so 100 times 100, and add to that how much the soybeans cost. So 80 soybeans times $50 a ton, and we add those two together and we get a nominal GDP of $14,000. If we want to know nominal GDP for 2013, we do the same procedure. We take the production in 2013, in this case 110 tons of corn, multiplied by the price of corn, $110 per ton. Add to that the cost of soybeans, so 80 soybeans times 100, and that gives us a nominal GDP of $20,100. So in nominal terms, it looks like we've grown by a whole heck of a lot. In percentage terms, we've basically grown 43.57% in nominal terms from year 2012 to 2013. And if we do the same procedure for 2014, we do 90 times 120 plus 80 times 110, and that gets us a total nominal GDP of $19,600. So did we shrink from 2013? Yes, we did. But are we bigger than we were in 2012, In nominal terms, the answer is yes, and by a significant amount. But are we really doing that well? To find out for certain, we need to see whether GDP is increasing because the prices are going up or because we're producing more items. And that's where real GDP comes into play, because now we're going to eliminate the effect of price changes and look at only the changes in output. Now, real GDP in a base year is always the same. So if we choose 2012 as the base year, then the nominal GDP will be the same as real GDP. It really doesn't matter which base year you pick. In most questions, you're told which year is the base. But knowing what the base year is important because we can't calculate without it. So if we treat 2012 as the base year, it means that we're going to use 2012's prices and see how much it would cost in that base year to buy this year's production. So to find the real GDP for 2013, we would take this 110 tons of corn and multiply it by the price in 2012, by the base year price of $100. And add to that the 80 tons of soybeans we produced in this year, 2013, and multiply it by the price in 2012, and add those two numbers together. And when we do, we get a number, $15,000. So did GDP increase? Yes, it did increase. But did it increase by 43%? The answer here is no. In real terms, GDP only increased by 7%. And again, the reason why is because most of the change in nominal GDP was caused by this increase in price. We saw corn increase 10%. We saw soybeans increase by 100%. We weren't producing a whole lot more of anything, only 110 tons, 10 tons more of corn than we were the year before. Soybeans remained the same. So we saw this huge jump in nominal GDP, but it meant very little in terms of our actual output. It was always driven by the change in price. If we look at real GDP for 2014, we do the same process. We would take the 90 tons of corn in 2014 and multiply it by the price in the base year. So that would be 90 times the 100. And 80 tons of soybeans times the $50 price in the base year, and that gets us a real GDP number of $13,000. So again, the real GDP is important because it looked like, in nominal terms, as if we were bigger in 2014 than we were in 2012. But in real terms, we're actually smaller. The economy's gotten a lot worse than we may have realized. And the reason why is because now we're producing fewer items. We're only producing 90 tons of corn instead of 100. And the only reason the nominal GDP was higher was because the prices kept going up. So this real GDP measure is very, very important to being able to make comparisons from year to year and making sure the economy is actually getting stronger or not. You'll have an opportunity to practice this new skill of calculating nominal and real GDP, as well as practicing identifying what items are and are not included in GDP when you come to class.